Welcome to TRS Clips, where you'll find happiness through your own curiosity. Is one able to predict America's moves, geopolitically speaking, post-World War II?
Post-World War II, the moves were very predictable. It was all predicated on containing Russia, on containing the USSR. And they were able to do it spectacularly well. Why did the USSR ultimately collapse? It's because of the pressure built by the Americans, who controlled all the sea routes, all the trade routes, all the supply chains. The USSR controlled only the Eastern European nations, the Warsaw Pact nations, and even the Chinese were on the US side eventually. And they had no access to the warm waters of the world ocean. And they were cut off from the global supply chains. So the only thing that they had was their own nation, which is an autarky. Everything they can imagine, all the resources they can imagine are available in their own nation, because it's such a vast landmass. But they were not able to project power anywhere. Let's say they wanted to project power in the South China Sea, they could not do it. Project power in the Indian Ocean region, they could do so to a certain extent, but not much. 71 was the last time they projected power. And that's why India was able to bifurcate Pakistan and give rise to Bangladesh, because of Russian actions that offset the US bullying of India. The Americans and the British had sent aircraft carrier strike groups in the Bay of Bengal to bully India and to allow the Pakistanis to continue the genocide of Bengali Hindus in East Pakistan. But the Russians sent a nuclear submarine fleet to face off against the British and the Americans. And that's why India was able to liberate Bangladesh. That is 71. What happens in 73? The US takes possession of Diego Garcia. If you look at the Lakshadweep and Maldives Islands, Maldives on the north, you have the Lakshadweep Islands. A continuation of the same island chain is the Maldives, and it culminates in the south with the Chagos Islands, which are illegally controlled by the British, and they have given the island of Diego Garcia to the Americans, where the Americans have a major Air Force base, naval base, and a very sophisticated network of radars. So they took possession of this, the Americans, in 1973, as a response to the debacle of 1971, where they could not bully India into letting the Pakistanis continue their genocide. So that is the situation right now. So the Americans, their activities could be very easily understood during the Cold War era in the 20th century. It was all about the competition with Russia, with the USSR, and other nations that were friendly with the USSR, like India. So India was in the American bad books. That's why they supported Pakistan so much. The Americans financed and funded Pakistani terrorism against Afghanistan and India for more than 2 decades, until at least 2008, when the Mumbai attacks happened. After that, maybe it has gone below the surface to some extent. But that's the deal. In the 21st century, the American actions are kind of more complicated. On the one hand, the nation they really fear is Russia. But the nation against which they seemingly do their moves is China. So they would like to use India as a counterbalance to China. But India itself is a rising power. In 20 years, India could be the next China. So they use nations like Pakistan as a counterbalance to India. So that's why Pakistan is so important again in the US eyes, and even in the Chinese eyes. So there is all these multiple layers of competition and geopolitics happening. The main threat for the US is Russia. People think it's China, but it's Russia. Russia is the real hard power that the Americans fear. And obviously there's this competition and collaboration with China. The American economy and the Chinese economy are joined at the hip, actually. The Chinese have bought incredible amounts of US treasury bonds. So they own a lot of US debt. And that means that the Americans eventually will have to repay that debt. And if they don't repay the debt, it means the US dollar is finished. The US dollar. And if the US dollar is finished, it means the US is finished, because that's all the US have. The US superpower status is predicated on 2 things. First, their control of the global economy, which is entirely based more or less on the US dollar being the reserve currency, global reserve currency. And secondly, the power projection ability, because they have more than 800 military bases, American military bases beyond American territory, spread across the world. These 2 factors have made the US the superpower. If the US dollar collapses, how will they sustain those 800 military bases, and so on and so forth? So the US and China are joined at the hip. The Chinese owe a significant amount of US debt. The Americans someday will have to pay it, or they'll have to decide that they are no longer a superpower or not. So that's where we are. It's very complicated in the 21st century, much more complicated. Of course, we have the benefit of hindsight to see the Cold War of the 20th century. We understand it very well. Similar things are happening right now, but it's no longer a bipolar world. The 20th century was a bipolar conflict, the US versus the USSR after the Second World War. Today you have a multipolar world. You have one single superpower, you have a near superpower, which is Russia, you have a declining great power, which is China, and you have a rising middle power, which is India. And then you have nations like France and Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia, etc., Indonesia in the mix, which are kind of below the middle power status, but which are going to rise if they do things properly.
Hey, if you enjoyed today's clip, make sure you check out all the other clips we've uploaded on this channel. You'll find a clip related to almost every single topic as long as you're willing to search for it.